inject communism into America. There was a white journalist, a muckraker, he called himself, by the name of John Reed. And he said that the way to actually inject communism into America is through the American Negro. And he said the problem is that the American Negro is not politically conscious. We have to raise the political consciousness of the American Negro. And to the extent that we do that, we can gain a foothold in America. And so Vladimir Lenin himself greenlit using any means necessary to raise the political consciousness of the American Negro. And by this time, you had so many different so-called Black Wall Streets scattered throughout the South, North Carolina, South Carolina, Texas, Oklahoma, and others. Over the course of the rest of the 1920s, you saw all these race riots springing up seemingly out of nowhere after Vladimir Lenin greenlit using any means necessary to raise the political consciousness of the Negro. The idea behind the race riot is to burn down the Black business. That's the whole idea. That's the whole concept.
Visit us for updates and shows at affinityextra.co.uk.
The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are personal and do not necessarily represent the views of Affinity Extra.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Ideologees, the place where we talk about the ideological spectrum that undergirds all the issues of your life. I'm your host, Mr. Mark G, and we have Mr. Roger Moore.
Hey guys, I'm here. I'm in the house.
How you doing? So Roger, I just want to start by saying that there's particular statements that people say. You already know. There's a few particular quotes that if someone says it, if you drop it, you will know who I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Hopefully,
you know your hip hop. So more money, more problems. Who are we talking about?
You're talking about the probably the second best.
Second best rapper. Wow. Okay. All right. They got a Tupac big debate there. I wonder what our guest who he prefers, Tupac or Biggie, but we'll find out. We have by the way, we have a very special guest today. But Biggie, right?
Yeah.
Okay. What about let's do one that's really, really old. To be or not to be? That's the question. What comes to mind when you hear that?
William Shakespeare.
Yeah. So I hate that class. Why are we reading that kind of English, bro? Like, anyway.
Yeah, cool.
All right, I got one more.
Go on.
I have a dream.
Mate, the dream of all dreams, mate. You know what I'm saying? The dream that makes everything. Martin Luther King, bro.
Yeah,
if you don't know that, man. If you don't know that, guys, you know what I'm saying?
You're living under a rock. You're definitely Amish. You're definitely Amish. Just happened to get on this podcast. You're definitely an Amish.
They've gone past his statue, man. They had the day off. Yes, so they know what it is. You know what I'm saying? MLK Day, man.
Yeah.
Juneteenth. Is it Juneteenth? Juneteenth, innit? Yeah.
Juneteenth is when they celebrate.
Yeah.
I wonder what our guest thinks about Juneteenth, actually.
Cool. That's cool.
So guys.
Come on, introduce.
Martin Luther King is a celebrated figure, a well-respected figure, not just in the United States, but across the world. But lately, there's been a rising political commentator in the political space who has got a very interesting perspective on Martin Luther King. And in fact, he's sharing that with the world in a form of a documentary series. Ladies and gentlemen, today we have a guest, Mr. Chad Jackson, documentary filmmaker. Chad, how you doing?
I'm very well. How are you?
I just want you to chime in on that little conversation. Like real quick, Tupac or Biggie, who would you take?
I have no preference.
Fair play.
I love that.
Fair play. Chad, you used to rap, right? Because I know in some of you've been doing a little rap in some of your posts. Is that something that you used to do?
When
is the Chad Jackson album coming out?
I think if you're a heavily melanated person, then you've had a rap career at some point in your life.
That's actually true. That's actually true. That is actually true. What was your rap name? Chad? Go and tell us.
I'm not saying. But
come on, Chad. Come on, Chad.
But I do a lot of writing. I write a lot of lyrics. I I do actually, believe it or not, have an EP on Spotify. Actually, it's
Whoa.
on Spotify, Amazon Prime, or I'm sorry, Amazon Music, anywhere you can stream music. It's called Chad's Anthology, and it's a bunch of lyrics that I wrote um, for this EP, and it's sung by different artists. So I do a lot of writing. I'm actually a far better writer than I am a singer or a rapper or anything like that. So,
Cool. Yeah, it's got that's
Fair
so
good.
play. Fair
That's
play.
good. That's good. That's good.
So maybe our first question is, for those who are new to you, can you walk us through the journey which has brought to you where you are today? Just tell us a little bit about your journey before we get into the main topic.
well, sure. So I've always been into film and into storytelling. It's something that I've always been drawn to, even though I don't really watch a lot of TV or movies these days because I'm on this side of it where I'm actually making my own films and documentaries. But it's something that I seriously wanted to pursue in high school. Where I went to high school here in Texas, we had a career tech kind of elective school that all the students who were interested in a career or technology, some kind of profession, would go to as far as their electives were concerned. And so I went to this school as an elective for filmmaking, particularly documentaries. Excuse me, my throat's dry. So, so I went to this school. It's called Ben Barber. I wanted to make films. I wanted to pursue that medium of storytelling, and that kind of culminated with the fact that I've always been very inquisitive, very interested in history and research, and so I wanted to make documentaries about the research, about the history that I was discovering. And so when I graduated high school, I met my then girlfriend, now wife, and I realized very quickly because I graduated in 2008, and a lot of my older friends who were graduating from college at the time couldn't find jobs because we were in what was called the Great Recession. And I realized, there are a lot of careers and professions out there that are not recession proof. And so, if I want to actually start a family and make money, I need to actually have a job that can survive a recession, that can survive the ebbs and flows of the economy. And having grown up in a household where my dad was an excavator, he worked with heavy machinery, bulldozers, scrapers, uh, front end loaders, things of that nature. And my dad being one of 13 brothers and sisters, all of whom, all of his brothers were in some kind of trade, one or the other. I had an uncle who was a builder, an uncle who's a carpenter, an uncle who's an electrician, an uncle who is who does work with bricks and stones. And growing up and watching my uncles and my dad come together, pull all their skills together, build houses, build add on rooms, um, clear plots of land. This is something that I've always been exposed to, and my dad was one of those tough, you know, uh, patriarchal figures who rarely let my brother and I sit down and take a break. I mean, we didn't even know what the indoors looked like because we were always outside doing something that my dad would have us doing. And so work and hard work was not new to me. It wasn't something was that was undesirable, so to speak. So by the time I came of age and I realized that I need a job that's going to actually make money and that's not going to be affected by who's in the White House, by what's going on in Washington D.C. or what have you, I decided to become a plumber's apprentice. And so after doing the whole plumbing thing, I was able to take my master plumbing exam when I was 25, became a master plumber. And while I was going to training school to be a plumber and I was working as a plumber's apprentice and then eventually as a journeyman, at the same time, I was involved to some degree with the Republican Party of Dallas, the Dallas County Republican Party. And I became quickly disillusioned with a lot of the things that went on with the Republican Party in terms of this notion that politics is going to fix everything. There was no practical solutions. to the problems that we face in Dallas County, to some of the issues that we face in our local community. When I would go to these executive Republican meetings, it was kind of like going to church for politics, and I just really wasn't into it. Here I was, a plumber's apprentice who had aspirations of one day starting my own business. And I realized quickly that the Republicans are much like the Democrats insofar that they believe that all will just go well if we can just get our person into office. And I understand that that is the point of a Republican executive meeting or a Democrat executive meeting, is to try to strategize, figure out how to get someone into office or what have you. I understand all that. That's not lost on me. However, there was just it just brought a lot of perspective, because that was politics was the end all to be all when it comes to a lot of the people who I was in this meeting or this club with. And so by the time I was ready to start my business, I was already disillusioned. I went ahead and bowed out of the Dallas County Republican Party. Still vote for Republicans. I mean, you have to vote for somebody. But I left the party. And at the time that I left the party and was focusing on my business, I was approached by a filmmaker here in Dallas named Justin Malone. And Justin asked if I would sit down for an interview for a film that he was making called Uncle Tom. And at first, when I heard this, I assumed that this filmmaker was probably a leftist, was somebody who was probably trying to make an exploitative film of some sort. And so initially, I was very reluctant to sit down for the interview. But then I thought about it and prayed about it, and was like, you know what? I mean, I understand that you can edit somebody to make them sound like a fool or what have you, but I know what I believe. I know what I stand for. I'll sit down for this interview. So they came to my office and interviewed me, and the interview actually went really well. They asked a lot of really good questions. They were able to take that footage and fly to LA and meet with Larry Elder, the famed conservative commentator and radio host. And they showed Larry Elder this footage of the interview that they shot with me. And Larry said, I want in on this. And they made a deal. Justin Malone and Larry Elder made a deal to go in on this film, with Larry Elder being the executive producer, which meant that Larry Elder helped raise funds for the film, and he connected Justin with other more well-known Republican conservative commentators like Candace Owens, like Brandon Tatum, Alan West, Herman Cain, the late Herman Cain, and others. And so that film became Uncle Tom, which was released in 2020. By this time, my plumbing company, even without the Uncle Tom film, because I tried my best to keep my plumbing business and my film endeavors completely separate. In fact, a lot of my plumbing customers don't know anything about the things that I do in media, but that's neither here nor there. My plumbing company was doing really well. We had around 30 some odd employees. We were heading in the right direction. And after the success of Uncle Tom, Justin came to me and said, hey, I understand that you have a background in film and that you're a natural researcher. What if you just came and worked with us to help produce Uncle Tom Part 2, a sequel to the film? And I thought about it, prayed about it, and said, you know what? That actually is, like, filmmaking is my first love. And if that doesn't work out, I always have my master plumbing license to fall back on. So what I did was I downscaled my plumbing company, and I went ahead and signed on with Malone Pictures, and I helped produce Uncle Tom 2. I did the majority of the research for the film. I was responsible for a lot of the direction that the film went in. And that was released in 2022. And so since then, I have gone independent, and I started what's called Historia Revelata, which is a company that exists specifically for the purpose of recontextualizing history in its proper lens and its proper framework, and doing so from a biblical perspective. Um, so our first film, our first series, is the MLK Project. It's a docuseries that really looks at what the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King were really trying to do. How the narrative that we're all taught in schools is completely off, it's completely wrong, and it's deceptive and manipulative, quite frankly. Um, and I don't know, maybe we'll talk more about that here in a moment, but that's our pilot film. We hope to cover a lot more subjects and topics as it pertains to feminism, as it pertains to family formation, as it pertains to ancient Rome, as it pertains to the Enlightenment era, as it pertains to a whole slew of other topics and subjects. And so, Historia Revelata will produce films, literature, documentaries, um, children's books, even that can be used as resources for students at every walk of life. So that's what I'm up to these days.
I will most certainly get more into your documentary about Martin Luther King. But from that first answer, and Roger, I definitely want to weigh in. The two things that stood out to me, and Roger also, you're a dad, I'm a dad.
Yeah.
One thing that stood out to me is Chad talked about his dad and how he really made sure that Chad was like in the straight and narrow. Like he wouldn't be he wouldn't be playing Xbox or PlayStation. He's outside doing something. I mean, there's something I think we can agree on, like all of us as dads, that the importance of fathers and
100%.
fathers who are involved. Roger, maybe you can weigh on that. I mean, that's something that we should encourage more.
I think something that we don't celebrate it enough because we focus on the negative side of what dad so-called fathers do, but there are a lot more than what people think there are. Fathers are a positive role model, and then when you're growing up, you don't appreciate them because you don't appreciate some of them. You don't appreciate until you become. Some things my son's annoyed with me about, and I just say, listen, I don't really care if you don't like me now. You know what I'm saying? When you get older, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
You appreciate it. And I think it's great hearing a foundation. I think we can't shy about when we come into spaces as men who have positive male role models, because people look at us and assume that we don't have a father. Yeah. And it's not the truth. You know what I mean? And it's good to actually put it out there, like, yeah, we've had father roles, positive
Good
father
fathers, yeah.
role. It's not perfection, you know what I'm saying? Because we try to tweak some of the things in you, but we appreciate what they did the best with what they had. You know what I'm saying? And they prepared us for a world that isn't sometimes fair. And sometimes we raise the children wrong, thinking that things are going to happen fair. Sometimes they let you fall over because, mate, you got to feel pain. If you don't feel this pain right now, when you feel it later, you might not have a chance to get back up. So, so it's a great shout out to positive father role models and what they do for us, especially young men growing up. I think it's real positive.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, there are people out there who will try and combat about the idea about the importance of fathers. But let's just say that's something that we all agree that fathers are very important, very key in raising us to be disciplined and productive members of society. Absolutely. 100%. Now, before I go on to my next topic, I would like you mentioned a few conservative figures who are involved in that film. I watched that film. Another name that you forgot to drop, but it's one of those last but by no means list, is the late Reverend Vodi Bolcom. He was actually one of my favorite preachers I used to like to listen to on YouTube. Maybe you can share your thoughts of who he means to you. Obviously as somebody who you have interacted with personally. Let me give you actually a very interesting story about Vodi Bolcom. Roger, there's one time Vodi Bolcom preached in London.
Okay.
And there was a queue of people who are going to ask him questions. And at the very time, I was like, how can I say? You wouldn't believe it, but I was very left-leaning. I was Christian, I was biblical, but I was very left-leaning. He went to a Reformed Calvinist church and he preached there. And there was a queue of people who wanted to ask him questions. When it came to my turn, he looked at his watch and he said, I go get my ride. So I didn't have a chance to ask him the question. The question I actually wanted to ask, which I eventually came to the conclusion was, why is the idea of socialism so incompatible with Christianity? I mean, socialism is all about helping people, right? And I thought that Vodi would, enlighten me on that. But that aside, Vodi Boko is a wonderful. He was a wonderful man of God, a wonderful father, and he was a faithful preacher of the gospel. Chad, maybe weigh in about your experience in your interactions with Vodi, and I'm sure that's somebody that is definitely sorely be missed by you, among others.
Yeah. Well, I don't know why my throat's so dry. So the I didn't actually forget to mention Vodi. When I was giving that list of names earlier, those were names that were specifically related to Uncle Tom One, the first
Okay,
film.
well, yeah.
Um, and on top of that, they were people who uh, Larry Elder specifically connected Justin Malone with. So Vodi Bakum was not one of the people who Larry had a relationship with or even knew. We got Vodi Bakum for Uncle Tom Part 2. So he is in
Okay.
the second film that was released in 2022. And that connection came by way of myself and Justin Malone's brother, Ryan. We're the ones that wanted to get Vodi Bakum in the film. And so Vodi Bakum was really a mentor to me. I mentioned earlier that I've been someone who, for a long time, was very interested in history, and really, Vodi has a lot to do with that. I mean, I remember being in high school and watching Vodi Bakum videos, his sermons, and listening to the things that he would say about, just what our relationship as Christians should be in, to our country and to the world, and how we are to be in the world, not of the world. Of course, these are biblical concepts, but to have a man among us who are boldly preaching the Bible unapologetically was very inspiring for me as a young man, especially as someone who grew up in church. The church that I went to was not a very doctrinally sound church. And it's interesting because I went to an all black church, and to the extent that I would hear sound doctrine, to the extent that I would hear sermons that were coherent, it was typically from white men, which I was always fascinated by that. Why is that? So of course, in my young mind, I'm I'm conflating sound doctrinal teaching to white pastors and riffraff all over the place non-doctrinal teaching to black pastors. Of course, it's ignorant to think that, but that's where my mind was.
Mhm.
But then when I heard Vodi Bakum, here was a man who had, who was a heavily melanated man who preached sound doctrine, who preached from the authority of the scriptures, and did so with boldness. And so by the time I was 18, I've already decided that if I ever have children, those children will be homeschooled, um, that we will be in a doctrinally sound reformed church. These are the things that I had believed by the time I was 18 as a result of many of the teachings of Dr. Vodi Bakum. It was actually by way of Dr. Vodi Bakum that I found out about John MacArthur and others. And not only that, it was by way of Dr. Vodi Bakum that I began to understand what cultural Marxism is when I was in my teens, and understand that Martin Luther King was a socialist. I first heard it from him back in like 2015, when I was 14, 15 years old. And so to hear him put all these things, break these things down, and then I went and researched them and found them to be true. It made me hungry for more knowledge, for more information as it pertains to history, as it pertains to the Bible, as it pertains to all these things. Little did I know that I would actually have a real relationship with Vodi Bakum later on. It's weird now that he's gone, not getting text messages from him. He was just a funny dude. He was just a very solid man of God. And I see his loss not as I see the loss of his earthly body not as a void, but as as a call, really, to step up and to double my efforts and to encourage other brothers in Christ to double their efforts, because we are living in a very lost generation, a dark and dying world that is giving way to hollow and deceptive philosophies that come and masquerade as the Christian faith, but really isn't. I mean, a lot of these things that we're hearing are counterfeit gospels. And Paul said, let those who preach a counterfeit gospel be accursed. And so I think that we have an obligation as God's remnant to preach Christ and Him crucified, and to do it with boldness, quite frankly. And Vodi Bakum exemplified that. And so it's interesting, we were able to interview him. We were able to follow him for a few weeks, shooting various speaking engagements that he would do, sermons that he would preach, in Huntsville, Alabama, and Florida, in Tennessee, Pennsylvania, Virginia.
You weren't able
So we
to follow
followed
him
him.
all the way to London, though. Man, so much for
It's
fun.
interesting.
You
I think
didn't
he
even
did some.
follow him all
He
the way
actually
to
studied at
London.
Oxford for a moment. But so yeah, we were able to capture a lot of footage of him, and a lot of the footage didn't actually make it in Uncle Tom 2. However, his presence in Uncle Tom 2 definitely, in my opinion, made the film better by a mile, if not more. I had the privilege of going to San Antonio and interviewing his mother, and was able to get her perspective of his upbringing, and just a kind of child that he was, a kind of teenager he was. And Vodi will forever hold a special place in my heart, just in terms of helping to mold me prayerfully and through the authoritative preaching of God's word into the man that I am today. So
Cool.
he'll be missed.
So I got a question, Chad. You mentioned about, because again, myself, I'm very much into documentary filming and history, being true to history. But it's interesting you said true to history from you mentioned your Christianity as a part of how you decipher the information. You know what I'm saying? A key part of how you portray it. Could you explain a bit more? Because everyone thinks when you look back at history, you just take the facts and you just put it out there. But your Christianity sounds like it plays a part in how you interpret history.
Yeah, that's a good question. That's actually a really good question. So whenever it comes to history, one of the things that you'll find is that many historians today, and I think this has probably always been the case, are ideologically driven. In other words, they try to frame history in such a way that it is automatically virtuous that the civil rights movement existed, that the feminist movement existed, that this movement existed, that movement existed. And so that's how they frame history, through an ideological bent. And I think, some people could argue that, oh, you're doing the same thing through a Christian lens. Noted. But I genuinely believe that, God is the author of truth. I genuinely believe that, when it comes to these philosophies, these are philosophies that should be dealt with and examined, not only in terms of how they disseminated, what are the historical facts of the means by which they were disseminated and employed in our government and so on and on the streets, but also what are the merits of these ideologies, because these are ideologies that have set themselves up against the knowledge and the wisdom of God, quite frankly. And so as a Christian, we are told not to participate in darkness, but to expose it. And so for me, I see my documentary filmmaking and I see my approach to history as an act of obedience to, once again, this call not to participate in darkness, but to expose it. And so for me, when I examine communism, socialism, collectivism, all these other isms, I see these as ideologies of darkness, and I have to expose them as such. And I have an obligation to stillman the arguments, to stillman these ideologies and say, look, okay, here's what communism is. Here's what they seek to do. Here's what they aim to do. Here's what they get wrong. And here's why it will never work. But here's why the gospel is so much better. And so, again, I receive that there are people who say, oh, well, you're just as ideologically driven as the secularists and the atheists. I can see why someone would say that, but I have fidelity to the scriptures, which once again, um, uh, I guess, prescribes that we as believers, as men of God, expose darkness. I don't believe that there's such a thing as neutrality. Neutrality doesn't exist. It's not real. Everybody filters their perception of the world through some kind of lens. The question is, what is that lens? Um, a person can say that they're neutral, but the reality is, as the old Bob Dylan song says, it may be the devil or it may be the Lord, but you're going to serve somebody. You know, we all serve somebody, we all serve something, even if it's our own stomach. And so for me, it'll be a lie to say, oh, well, I only just take the facts and whatever. Like, yes, I do take the facts, but at the same time, I think I have the upper hand insofar that God is the author of truth. That apart from God, there is no such thing as good. I don't believe that goodness is just something that you feel or something that you manifest or something that I don't have this kind of utilitarian view of what good is. I have more of a deontological view of what good is. Good is ingrained in the fabric of reality. And so there is a cosmic kind of understanding of what good is, and God is the manufacturer of good. Anything that is apart from that is not good. And so, anyway, I'm hoping that makes sense.
Oh yeah. You know, I'm getting to understand where you're coming from. But we see that movement obviously being grown up. Myself, I've grown up in the UK, and seeing Martin Luther King. And when we look at history from a lens of changes for the Black community, that period in the United States was a catalyst in a time that has impacted even to the levels people call it to changing. Pushing African nations to push back against it. So that change wasn't just for the African Americans, but also it was a push towards Black people of African people around the world, from the Caribbean to South America to so on. So it wasn't just a pivotal point for the US; it also was a pivotal point for, and that's how it's been being put out there as a pivotal point, a pivotal catalyst, that 50s, 60s, 70s, 60s period of that period where Martin Luther was majoring in Malcolm X and so on, of pushing, of really putting us where we are today as a black community around the world. That's how it's not just a US
not
thing.
just an American thing,
it's massive. So
but
just to add to it,
but Chad, I want to give you the space and the opportunity to lay out your position on who Martin Luther King Jr. is against the backdrop of the consensus that he is a hero, is somebody that is worth the reverence that is due. Obviously, people can check out your documentary, and I encourage everybody to do so, because we believe that we should listen to people from different perspectives. But could you just take 5 minutes and posit what is the conclusion that you have arrived to regarding the man, Dr. Martin Luther King? Give us a synopsis.
Well, the thing about it is, the things that I have to say are not a take. They're not a perspective to put into a word. It's truth. It's based upon and predicated on his own writings, the writings of those who are close to him, the writings of historians and authors who are ideologically aligned with King and want to continue his agenda even now. There's a book called Dangerous Friendship, written by a man by the name of Benjamin Kamen, who is ideologically aligned not only with King, but also with King's handler, Stanley Levison. Um, there's a book called Hammer and Hoe, written by Robin Kelly, a black man who calls himself a socialist feminist, a feminist socialist. He wrote a book which documents the history of communist activity in the South, places like Birmingham, Alabama, Montgomery, Alabama, and Atlanta, Georgia, among places dating as far back as the 1920s, which gives you a contextualized understanding of the milieu into which King was born. You have to understand the history. A lot of us, most of us around the world, don't really understand the history. We don't understand the context of who King was and why King was. And as a result of this, we become vulnerable and in many ways gullible and credulous to this narrative that's forced upon us from the time we are, from the time we're born, quite frankly. We get it in our education, both primary and secondary education. We get it in university. We get it in higher education. We get it in entertainment. All of your movies and songs that mention King do so in a positive and glowing way. We get it from our politicians, both on the left and the right. All of them have positive views of who King was. So we're sold a narrative. We're sold propaganda, quite frankly. And nobody ever stops to question, well, why? Why are we sold this particular kind of propaganda? What is the purpose of it? And if you know anything about the Tower of Babel, if you know anything about this time that exists in the history of humanity, where we all spoke the same language, we were all pretty much in the same location, and you had Nimrod who commissioned the building of this great tower, which would pay homage to self, which would pay homage to the greatness of man as a rebellion, an act of rebellion against God. And what did God do? He came down and he confused the languages, and he did this for the good of man. Because this collectivism, what it does is it creates a singular throat that can be slit with one fell swoop. But to the extent that we're dispersed and we're nations scattered around the world, and you have this kind of diversity of cultures, it's much more difficult to ruin mankind with one fell swoop. You have a much harder time in doing that. And the act of God, dividing and confusing the languages, it wasn't indicative of a God who doesn't want unity. He does want unity, but the unity that he wants is under the lordship of Jesus Christ. Because when the incarnate Christ would later come, put on flesh, teach the gospel of what the kingdom of heaven is like, die on a cross, buried, raises in 3 days, and then ascends, raises after 3 days and then ascends. What he's doing is he's giving us the means under which to unify his remnant, to unify. It's not the building of a tower made by human hands that we're building and are trying to ascend into the heavens by way of our own work. No, he ascends and he brings us with him, those of us who are willing. That's the ultimate unifying thing. But since the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus Christ, what we have done as we've rejected that, and we've said, no, we can try this whole Tower of Babel thing again. We can try it again, and we've tried with various different ideologies to rebuild Tower of Babel with human hands. We've done it through so many different isms and ideologies. And so what King is doing is he's attempting to build it through the ideology of socialism and communism. The difference is he's not outright calling it communism and socialism, because you have to understand King's ministry was in the midst of the Cold War, where you couldn't just come out and say that you're a communist. You had to do it clandestinely. You have to do it in a kind of covert way. And we have insight when it comes to his very own writings, when it comes to his very own correspondence, when it comes to the kind of education that he received and the milieu into which he was born, where King said that by the age of 13, he rejected the deity of Christ. He shocked the Sunday school class when he was 13 by rejecting the resurrection of Christ. He wrote during his college years that he also rejected the virgin birth. He rejected a literal existence of heaven and hell. He rejected just the fundamental tenets of the Christian faith. He didn't believe in any of it. He said that he was able to accept the liberal interpretation of theology quite readily by the time he went to college. And what was interesting about when he went to college is he was educated by professors who themselves were apostates, who didn't believe in the scriptures. They taught a liberal kind of secular interpretation of the scriptures, and they also taught him something called the Hegelian dialectic. He learned this at Crozer Theological Seminary, and he would further his education in this regard at Boston University. And basically, what this means is the Hegelian dialectic, as it pertains to his usage of it, was taking the thesis of biblical truth and the antithesis of communist ideology and synthesizing the tension between these two views through this kind of democratic progress, as it were. This is actually written about in so many words by Walter Lippmann in a 1922 book called Public Opinion, where he said that if a leader wishes to push a policy of campaign, but finds that the public do not agree with the policy of campaign that he wishes to push, what that leader must do, or what that leader does, is that he use rhetoric. He uses speeches and oratory to try to get the public into the good graces of that leader. He says that in this rhetoric, he appeals to symbols of religion, symbols of patriotism, symbols of pinching a grievance. And he said that the public, upon hearing these speeches, upon hearing this oratory, milling hither and thither, will lean in towards that leader, and they will demand that a policy of campaign be introduced. And that is a time to strike. And that leader will be called upon to introduce a policy of campaign that the public can get behind, and they will easily endorse and get behind that policy. Never mind the fact that that policy is disconnected and divorced from the rhetoric that you use in the first place. It doesn't matter that King said in the I Have a Dream speech that I have a dream one day that my 4 little children will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of the character. That is what he said in the speech, which is a meritocratic thing that, who won't get behind that? But that's altogether different. It's a complete departure and disconnect from the Civil Rights Act of 1964 or 63. Yeah, 64, where you're giving the government the power to basically have a foothold in your small business, dictating who you serve, who you don't serve, who you hire, who you don't hire. That is an infringement on your constitutional right to freedom of association, right? And so the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was unconstitutional law. And not only that, it bred resentment. It instilled a sense of bitterness and entitlement in the minds of many Blacks in America. And there was a drastic shift that took place in the 1960s going into the 1970s as far as so-called Black America is concerned. From the 1800s to the 1950s, you saw an upward trajectory in terms of literacy among so-called Blacks, among family formation and the marriage rates among so-called Blacks, among home ownership when it comes to so-called Blacks and entrepreneurship. You had this trending in the right direction. Why is that? Well, the reason that is because you had men like Booker T. Washington and George Washington Carver and the Negro Business League, who basically made it plain and made it simple that the way to become successful in a Western country like America is through conventional means, honing your resources, putting your best foot forward, being a person of character. This, applying yourself. Yes, there's people who aren't going to like you. There's people who's going to be jealous of you. All these things are true. And guess what? Black people don't have a monopoly on mistreatment. Everybody's mistreated by someone at one degree or another. And so we can't wallow. We can't cry. We have to try. We can't be a crying race. We have to be a trying race. And so this is what Booker T. Washington and others really instilled. And the so-called blacks were implementing these practical, conventional ideas and practices in the same way that many whites were, in the same way that many Asians were and Hispanics. And you saw real progress. You saw upward trajectory. In 1920, the communists were trying to figure out how to really make inroads into America. They had the Second Congress of the Communist International in Moscow, and they were trying to figure out just how to inject communism into America. There was a white journalist, a muckraker, he called himself, by the name of John Reed. And he said that the way to actually inject communism into America is through the American Negro. And he said the problem is that the American Negro is not politically conscious. We have to raise the political consciousness of the American Negro. And to the extent that we do that, we can gain a foothold in America. And so Vladimir Lenin himself greenlit using any means necessary to raise the political consciousness of the American Negro. And by this time, you had so many different so-called Black Wall Streets scattered throughout the South, North Carolina, South Carolina, Texas, Oklahoma, and others. Over the course of the rest of the 1920s, you saw all these race riots springing up seemingly out of nowhere after Vladimir Lenin greenlit using any means necessary to raise the political consciousness of the Negro. The idea behind the race riot is to burn down the black business. That's the whole idea. That's the whole concept of it. And of course, the communists can say, look, white supremacy is alive and well. They don't want Negroes to have businesses. They're jealous of the Negroes. They're burning down their business. That's the whole idea, is to pit white against black. Because as Manning Johnson, the former communist who defected, said, the objective of the communists is that the Negro will unite not with ordinary white people, but with the communists, with the white communists. That's what their objective is. And so if I'm Joe, the black shoe store owner, and I have a business, a shoe store in Greenwood district, Tulsa, Oklahoma, and all of a sudden a race riot breaks out and my shoe store burns down, and I no longer have a means to provide shoes for my community, to make money, and then to spend that money with my neighbor, and so on and so forth. If I no longer have that, if the free market means of being successful and of making my living is completely gone, and then I pick up the newspaper one day and I see at the bottom of the newspaper an ad, tired of white supremacy, join the IWW, which was a communist front group, join the NAACP, which was a socialist group, join this movement, join that movement, all these communist front groups. The idea or the objective is to try to subliminally show the Negro that free market enterprise doesn't work for you. It doesn't work for anybody. Capitalism, they called it, doesn't work. Communism, socialism, that's how you get your success. That's how you get your freedom. That's how you get your liberation. That's the whole concept behind the race riot, is to so demoralize blacks from using conventional free market means of becoming successful, and to shift them and to basically shepherd them into more of a communist way of thinking. And it worked. And it would come to a head by the time Martin King would come of age, who was part of this communist socialist tradition. But the reason why it was able to work so well is because he was able to do it deceptively and manipulatively as a Christian pastor, even though he didn't believe the Christian faith that he looked like. I mean, they called him the moral leader of the nation. He was giving all these speeches. He didn't write a lot of the speeches. A lot of the speeches were written by his handlers, all of whom were communists. Stanley Levison, who was a secularist, an atheist, a Jewish, and that is to say that he's not black, I'm not coming for the Jews, but he was somebody who was completely hostile to the Word of God, yet he was a subversive insofar that he helped edit a magazine called The Churchman. He worked with Martin King, a Negro minister, and wrote these sermons for King, even though he didn't believe in the Christian God. Very subversive. You had Bayard Rustin, who worked with the Young Communist League. You had Clarence B. Jones, who was a part of a couple of communist front groups. All of these men are writing King speeches, and King is delivering them because he was a tremendous orator. There was a direct line of communication between the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was King's organization, and the Soviet Union. And so, again, all of these subversive manipulative tactics were to try to sway public opinion into thinking that all we want is civil rights. That's all we want. That's all we want. There's no subversion, no deception to see here. Anytime King was asked by the media whether there were any communists in his organization, he would just lie and say no. He said, in our bylaws, we prevent communists from joining our organization. He was just lying and being deceptive from the time he was in college to the day that he died. He was an advocate for something called democratic socialism. He would often talk about the virtues of democratic socialism in his closed-door SCLC meetings, according to firsthand testimony by his staff and according to the minutes from those SCLC meetings. He did this up until 1968, shortly before he died. So he never recanted from his disbelief, never, changed his mind about the things that he wrote about in college, as far as denying the resurrection, the virgin birth, the literal existence of heaven and hell. He never, said anything different. To the extent that he did, it was meant, once again, to be a deceiver, because he's a utilitarian, using any means necessary to accomplish your goal. And the goal was to Sovietize America. And so when we look at how other countries across the world, whether they be in Africa or Europe or whatever, Eastern Europe, to the extent that, we're told by our historians that the civil rights movement was such a great thing. Look at all these other liberation causes around the world who modeled or who fashioned their movements after the civil rights movement. Again, that's a bunch of propaganda, because the idea and the objective wasn't genuine liberation and the fight against colonialism or colonization. When you look at the money, you always have to follow the money at who funded the civil rights movement, who funded these so-called liberation movements. The fact that Nelson Mandela was himself a communist as well as his wife. When you look at the training that whether it be Nkrumah and all these others have gotten, Fidel Castro, all of these were communists. Fidel Castro even said that he wasn't a communist, before, while he was doing all of his agitation and his freedom fighting, he would say that he wasn't a communist. He wouldn't actually come out and say that he was a communist until after he won power in Cuba. Now, this is what they do. I mean, they did the same thing. The Bolsheviks did the same thing in the Soviet Union. And so again, all of its deception, all of its agitation, and we know, according to the scriptures, that God is not a God of confusion. And if you look at somebody like King and you're confused about, well, you said this thing, which I agree with, but at the same time, you said this other thing and you're doing this other thing. The reality of it is, if you have to wonder, then they're probably a communist. Because the reality of it is, somebody who is unapologetically steadfast in what saith the Lord, they're not going to flirt with these dark, hollow, and deceptive philosophies. And so I know I said a lot, and I tried my very best to answer your question, but
you did good.
The reason why these answers have to be as long-winded as they are is to not only say the thing that needs to be said, but to give the context and the backdrop to give understanding, because you're having to contend with so much indoctrination and so much propaganda that we've all gotten from the time we were crawling.
Oh, amazing! So I got some questions.
I have a question. So thanks. First of all, thank you for sharing that context.
Okay, cool.
But if I could just play devil's advocate, don't worry, with Team Jesus. But if I could just
Angel's
play,
advocate.
if I could just play angel's advocate or devil's advocate, but don't you think that the situation in America, kind of, it was an environment in which was conducive for an appetite for a more revolutionary rather than an evolutionary process of African Americans to achieve their sense of somebodyness. You know, Martin Luther King talked about how black people did not feel like they were somebody because the the Caucasian majority, unfortunately, deemed them as second class. And so, don't you think? I mean, I don't know, and of course, we did not live then. And to be quite frank, I think I think you were born the same age that I did. You were not born then, but don't you think that there was some negative, negative factors that may very bad negative factors in the sense of how African Americans were treated and how they see themselves that maybe made the the situation attractive to have a revolutionary process rather than an evolutionary. Because I imagine you are the type of person who, if the more idealistic way is the process in which the racism and the bigotry and the discrimination is go rid away is without the big government means or the means by which government can kind of flex their muscles to kind of um, even up the scales a bit. So could you, before Roger asked a question, could you maybe shed your light about that particular perspective as somebody who has researched this quite extensively?
Well, again, context is key. As I said earlier, blacks do not have a monopoly on suffering. Everybody suffers. Everybody goes through something. There's always going to be somebody who doesn't like you. That didn't go away because the Civil Rights Act of 1963 or 64 was passed. Not only that, once again, we saw as a
But Chad,
result.
wait. I can argue that. I can argue back and say, but at least there was legislation to mandate that you can't treat somebody that way. Does that make
We don't
sense?
need that legislation.
Okay.
We don't need legislation. I mean, the fact is, we need basic legislation that prohibits murder, that prohibits theft, that prohibits, mistreating your brother in terms of causing physical harm and things of this nature. But we don't need legislation that says that this business that you as a store owner put up your own money, maybe took out a loan to start, and you went through all the means and all the measures to build your business.
Mm-hmm.
The government can't then come in and say that you have to serve these people and you have to hire these people. You can't discriminate on this. That's none of the government's business. To the extent that we give the government that right.
But if echo,
Well, let me finish my point. To the extent that we give the government that right, that's an infringement upon your right and your freedom of association. That causes resentment, that causes turmoil, that causes bitterness, and it causes destabilization in the community. The free market, the key word there is free, right? Which means that you have the freedom to associate or disassociate how you please. And it conversely means that people have the right to disassociate with you. Freedom requires maturity. It requires people understanding that sometimes people just aren't going to like you, and that's okay. That doesn't then mean that we should give the government the right to have a foothold in how we conduct our affairs, how we run our business. If I'm not physically harming you, it's none of the government's business, and that's just the reality of it. The reality of it is, as a participant in the free market, if somebody isn't serving me because of the color of my skin or because I'm a man or whatever the case may be, I also have the freedom to spend my dollars elsewhere, to go to their competitor and spend my money, or maybe even to start my own business to compete with that business. That's what it boils down to in a free market. This whole idea of giving the government more and more of a foothold is in keeping with the Marxist ideology, because it is the Marxist, it is the communist who wants to centralize everything, including the means of production. And so we want to be careful with how much of how much of a foothold and how much authority that we give the government. In our country, in 1797, John Adams, who was then the president and who was also a participant in the ratification of the Constitution, said something that's key. He said that our Constitution, which is an exercise in self-government, our Constitution is for a religious and moral people. And by religious, he meant Christian. He didn't mean all these other religions, all these other pagan religions. He meant Christian. And so he said that our Constitution is for a moral and religious people. It cannot exist for any other kind of people. Because the thing about being a Christian people is the fact that we have the virtues that are necessary and having and holding a system of self-governance. To the extent that we lack virtues, we then need the nanny, the big brother to come in and dictate everything, dictate every aspect, every component of our lives. And so the reality of it is forced integration is unconstitutional, it's unlawful, and it actually has an adverse effect. In the same way, for segregation, the government having the right to segregate people is also unconstitutional. So I posit that the segregation laws which were on the books were unconstitutional and they needed to go away. But guess what? They were going away. They were going away through the reformative process, not the revolutionary process, the reformative process, because as Booker T. Washington predicted in 1898, I think it was, we need to cast down our bucket where we are, irrespective of if you're white, black, or any other ethnicity. Cast down your bucket where you are. Pool your resources. Be a man of honor. Be a woman of virtue. Don't worry about who doesn't like you or who likes you. Hone your resources. Pursue skills, and eventually these racial barriers will fall. And guess what? That was actually happening. There was a repealing of Jim Crow laws and ordinances at the private and at the local level, and in some cases at the state level. These vestiges from a bygone era were beginning to fall away through the reformative process as people in through the marketplace were beginning to transact with one another, irrespective of what laws were on the books. And a lot of these cases, including in Montgomery, Alabama, where they had the bus boycott, a lot of these laws weren't even being enforced, and they were soon to die of natural causes. The whole name of the game when it comes to communism is to identify grievances, exploit, and in many cases exaggerate those grievances to do exactly what you're talking about, which is to make people think that because this law exists or because that exists or because this grievance exists or because this thing isn't fair, we need revolution. So yes, I grant that revolution is attractive to unprincipled people who don't have the patience, who don't have the ability to understand that we live in a diverse society. And as a diverse society, there can be fault lines, everything can crumble and just shatter around us if we try to speed up a process and force people who are unwilling to see things the way that we see them, to do things the way that we want to do them, whatever the case may be. It has to be a slow, gradual reformation that takes place. But in the meantime, you have the right to associate how you please. And so, again, these things are falling away by natural causes. And so we can't sit here and pretend that, oh, black people, we had it so bad. Nobody else had it bad. Everybody else had it great. But black people, we had it so bad. We needed revolution. We have to, especially as Christians, be wise as serpents, but yet gentle as doves. We have to have discernment, right? There's no excuse for going for the revolutionary process, because the Bible says not to be taken captive by hollow and deceptive philosophies and by the elemental principles of the world, but by Christ. And so what King was doing, this whole revolution thing, he said that there needed to be a revolution of values. He would use all this Marxist rhetoric, talking about a radical redistribution of wealth, talking about there needs to be a universal income for everybody. He's touting Marxist ideology in all of his speeches. He's echoing and trafficking in hollow and deceptive philosophies that the Bible tells us not to be taken captive by. And it wasn't as though people were unaware. People were aware. You had men like Joseph H. Jackson. You had men like George Schuyler. You had women like Julia Brown, people like Manning Johnson, who were sounding the alarm of what King was doing. It was the press who was trying to drown these voices out, who were putting King on the cover of Time magazine, of Life magazine, giving him the Nobel Peace Prize, trying to make him look larger than what he actually was. They were being deceptive and manipulative, and many so-called Christians forfeited discernment because they were caught up in the spirit of the age. We have to keep our lamp oils filled as Christians. We have to operate with discernment and wisdom as Christians. We mustn't be taken captive by hollow and deceptive philosophies as Christians. Yes, we trip and we fall and we make mistakes every now and then, but to the extent that we do that, we're much like Peter, who asked Christ, if it's really you, bid me to walk on the water. Bid me to walk on the water out of the boat. And what did he do? He began to look at the storm raging around him, and he began to dip and sink. And it took Christ to pick him up out of that water. We have to keep our eyes on Christ instead of allowing ourselves to constantly, like wayward children, being blown in the wind by any demagogue or charlatan who comes out of nowhere promising and suggesting that he has a better way. Like King was being a deceptive liar, and a lot of people had the discernment to see him for that, but a lot of us didn't. And so I get what you're saying in terms of being the devil's advocate, but there's no excuse for us, as for those of us who call ourselves Christians, to be to be flirting with darkness.
So no, I hear where you're coming from with that. So ultimately, what you're saying that through the year we were going to get to the space of what we would say, I say equality, but everybody living together. There's almost a case of things were changing and moving that way. I've seen you talk about a minister of the Baptist church, I think it's the Baptist church, that was very, very, very massive in that time, and encouraged and invested into his community and encouraged good practice business wise and so on. And so on. So you almost really are saying that Martin Luther King was almost like a poster boy that was pitched in a period where it was a case of, after a lot of hard work by a lot of people before him, and the fruits of that labor was coming out and bearing fruit, you put a guy in his space, and he then becomes the poster boy. And when he dies, that all the people that he's basically, I'm not saying he's done nothing, but I don't want to be harsh, but it sounds like it was just and this is one thing that I find that a lot of preachers, evangelists are very good at. They're very good at literally communicating really, really well. We have a lot of great speakers in our spaces, and he's utilized that skill set to become the poster boy of change. And yourself has looked into him and his life behind that poster boy, I have a dream, and said, okay, let me go behind that, and going, who is this real guy? What is he really about? And digging into that, you actually found out, hold a second, it wasn't really down to this guy that made changes in these areas. And what he was pushing was communism and Marxism. Well, my question to yourself as well, when it comes to this, because I can hear questions that people will be asking, is you've mentioned Marxism and communism, socialism as almost anti-Christian theologies, so where would you pick? Because someone's going to say it, pitch where capitalism is Christianity kind of like, are you separating it from this spectrum, or are you saying that Christianity is not on that side of the spectrum, or is it on the right side of the spectrum, or it's not on that spectrum? So if somebody's coming as a hardcore capitalist and going, are we saying that is more Christian than socialism? Because someone's gonna ask the question. You're saying the left is not Christian, which respect to right extremes of the left. But growing up as a black community in America over here, you vote left, you vote social, you naturally just vote social parties. That's what we naturally do wherever we are. So I'm not saying it's moving more right now, yeah, but we naturally go social. So you're almost going, okay, well, that is not a Christian. We're growing up in church, says vote the socialist, so for social social parties and so on like that. And now you're saying, hold on a second, that's not Christian. Yeah? From what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely not Christian. The thing is, again, I mean, I hate to keep beating a dead horse here, but don't be taken captive by hollow and deceptive philosophies. Right? And not only that, even in the New Testament, when the epistles were being written, there were wolves among sheep, and this is why Paul and some of the other writers basically called them out and said, don't fall captive to. I'm sorry, my phone's ringing. Don't fall captive to what they call counterfeit gospels. There's people who are preaching counterfeit gospels, and the whole point in preaching a counterfeit gospel is to deceive people into thinking that it is the actual gospel, right? If it was that easy, it wouldn't be called deception. Or if it wasn't, how do I want to frame that actually? Sorry, I got distracted by my phone ringing. If it was easy to decipher and easy to distinguish, it wouldn't be called deception. The very purpose and the very intent of deception is to make something seem so much like the real thing, so much like the authentic thing, that people don't know the difference. And so this is the reason why there's people who say, well, Jesus would have been a socialist. Jesus would have been a Marxist. Jesus would have been a communist. They say that foolishly because these are people who genuinely, I'm just going to put this on airplane mode.
But Chad, what Roger is, sorry, if I may, what Roger is trying to say is, obviously you've made a strong argument that yes, Jesus is not a socialist or a Marxist, but you wouldn't go the other extreme and say that Jesus is a free market, loving money, capitalist kind of guy, because a lot of people they might define, since you're so anti-left, that you're advocating everything on the other side of the aisle, which is free market, get all the money you want. And of course, we see many warnings from scripture, from Jesus and his apostles about the love of money being the root of all evil. So Chad is, what Roger is asking, is there not a balance as well?
That clarification is helpful. And the question is a really good question, and I thank you for asking it. You'll notice that in this interview, what do I keep saying? I keep saying free market. I don't say
capitalism. Yeah, I noticed that. Yeah,
I don't say capitalism. Yeah. I do that on purpose because I'm not an advocate for capitalism. When I hear the word capitalism, I focus on those last three letters, ISM, ism, which connotes a belief system or a doctrine that one holds to, in many cases above all other doctrines. The pursuit of capital is not a doctrine that I subscribe to. It is. Here's the thing. The reason why the free market system is the best economic system for a civilized people is because it is the only system that most closely appreciates how mankind is wired over any other system. Because it's a system that's predicated on this notion that you sleep in the bed that you make. You get out what you put in. If you're willing to put in the effort, if you're willing to pursue a skill, you reap the benefits of that. You reap what you sow. If you choose not to, if you choose to be lazy, or if you choose to be an advocate, or versus like actually doing the work, then you don't get anything out of it. Right? So it's a system that most closely respects how mankind is wired. A communist system cannot work because it's a system predicated on this notion from each according to their ability to each according to their need. We get our rations, and regardless of how much work you put in, you get the same. There's no belief in private ownership of property or anything of this nature. And because the system doesn't work, in order to implement it, you have to extinguish those who are not willing to play along.
Yeah.
And this is what actually happened
When
in
it's
Mao's
easy.
China. This is what actually happened in the Soviet Union. This is what actually happened in Fidel Castro's Cuba. Those who were considered to be enemies of progress or enemies of the people were lined up against a wall and shot and thrown into mass graves, right? And others were sent to concentration camps and the gulags and forced labor and and not only that, you had these strains on the economy and so on and so forth. We had something like that here in the United States under FDR as well. And so the reality of it is that socialism, communism, all these other isms are blatantly anti-gospel. But when it comes to the free market system, was Jesus a free market enthusiast? No. Jesus was for God's kingdom. He was always preaching God's kingdom. He would always give parables. The kingdom of heaven is like this. The kingdom of heaven is like this. The kingdom of heaven is like this. We as his remnant are in the world, but we're not of the world. We don't attach ourselves to these hollow and deceptive philosophies, whether they be on the extreme right or the extreme left. But while we're on this planet, we can acknowledge that the free market system, again, respects the way mankind is wired more so than all of these other economic philosophies, so on and so forth.
Got you.
What we do see from Jesus is operating within the system. We can see that this in some of his parables. For example, the talents that were given. One was given 5, one was given 2, another was given 1. The one who was given 5 invested and was able to utilize these talents and double them. The same is true of the one who was given 2, and the one who was given 1 went and buried it. And as a result of his foolishness, he was forced to give what he had to the one who had 5. That's actually how it works in a free market system, because those who don't put in, those who don't, those who are not good stewards of what they have, is typically the ones who are the most ambitious who end up getting what even they have. And so again, the reality of it is we cannot subordinate the savior of the world to man-made philosophies and man-made traditions and man-made
Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world." Yeah.
The reality is that Christ's kingdom is not of this world. It's so far above and beyond this world. But we as his remnant, we pray and we're taught to pray that it will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So as a result of this, we have an obligation to preach Christ and him crucified and to be exemplars of the gospel. But what that doesn't mean is coercing our neighbor to pay taxes that will go and do the thing that we are to be doing ourselves. What happened whenever the people were fatigued after a long day of following Jesus around and they were listening to his teachings? His disciples said, "Hey, the hour is getting late. Send them into the market so they can get some food, and send them and let them be somebody else's problem." What did Jesus say? You feed them. You feed them. Not the taxpayer, not the government dispersing. No, you feed them. And so it's very peculiar to me that so many people who call themselves Christians believe that they are somehow morally righteous in this idea that they want to punt the responsibility of taking care of the poor to the government and to their fellow taxpayer who may or may not share their values. You feed them.
Well,
and so for me, it's like we have an obligation and a responsibility as people of God and as followers of Christ to actually put into practice the teachings of Christ. This doesn't mean that you plant your stake in the Republican Party because, you believe that the Republican Party is at work implementing the teachings of Christ, because they're not. This doesn't mean that you plant your stake in the Democratic Party because they placate as though they care for the poor. Like, no, you feed them. Like, the teachings of the gospel are for you who have called Christ Lord. That's what the gospel is for, right? He came that many would be saved. And so I think the trick and the problem that many of us trip up on is that we try subconsciously to subordinate Christ to our political and economic philosophies. And that's what I take issue with.
That's good, but here's another twist for me on yourself, and just yourself as a human being, as a black man. Now putting together a series which is against one of our black, so in inverted commas, I'm doing this, yeah, in inverted commas, Christian major leaders. What sort of how I can imagine you will be getting a lot of I'll say very mildly abuse, but a lot of commentary about yourself as a person. Why is a black man going out his way to tear down another a great, I put in inverted commas, a great leader for black? You wouldn't be where you are if it wasn't for this guy. That's the people's perspective of him. How do you have you had a lot of people criticize you as a black man doing this?
Of course I have. Here recently, there's a political commentator. Her name is Angela Stanton King.
Mm-hmm.
And she recently made that claim. And she did so by tweeting a picture of President Trump with Alveda King, who was Dr. Martin Luther King's niece. And Trump passed some legislation, or I'm sorry, he signed some legislation that I forget exactly what the legislation did. I think it basically, I'm not even going to attempt to try to say what it did, but it was something in honor of Martin Luther King.
Mm-hmm.
And he's handing her the pen in this picture that he used to sign this legislation into law. And Angela Stanton King's commentary was, here you have a white man, President Trump, who is furthering the legacy of King. And he's doing this even though he's accused of being a white supremacist. Meanwhile, you have this black man, Chad Jackson, talking about me. She said, meanwhile, you have this black man, Chad Jackson, who's doing everything that he can, using his entire platform to tear down a king, to tear down Martin Luther King. And, this is somebody who looks like me, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what she's insinuating in that tweet is that as a so-called black man, my fidelity should be to further the narrative of other black people, like King, whether they're right or wrong. That's not who I am at all.
Wow.
I don't have fidelity to somebody just because they are heavily melanated. My fidelity is to the scriptures. My fidelity is to the truth. Martin Luther King wasn't a great leader. He was a great deceiver. And it goes back to what I said earlier, that what I'm doing is an act of obedience, not to participate in darkness, but to expose it. Communist philosophy is darkness. And what has happened under the behest of King and the Civil Rights Movement is that they were able to subvert this Marxist ideology into the so-called black church, making the church not an institution for edification amongst believers, that we might draw near to God, that God will draw near to us, as it says in James, but rather an institution of political propaganda. That's what many so-called black churches are today. They preach politics from the pulpit. They preach universal income and universal health care and universal this and universal that, doing the very thing that I was speaking against earlier in terms of you feed them, right? You be the body. It's on you to be the salt and the light of the earth, right? It's on you to keep your lamp oil filled. That commission is for you. Not that the government will be the salt and the light, not that the taxpayer, your fellow taxpayers by coercion from the IRS and from the government will be the salt and the light, but no, that you will be the salt and the light. The Great Samaritan didn't punt his responsibility to the government or to his fellow taxpayers. It was on him to do it. And so the reality of it is, again, so many so-called black churches following the trajectory by the likes of Martin Luther King are peddling poison from behind the pulpit, right? And so that's something I want to expose. Not that people would hate Dr. Martin Luther King. I don't want anybody to be hated,
Yeah.
but rather to analyze those ideas, to educate people and to have the conversation on what the distinction is from the authentic gospel of the Bible versus the counterfeit so-called social gospel that King preached. What's the distinction there? Because I want people to understand and have clarity of what the gospel is, that we might then repent and go down the right path, the straight and narrow path. That's what my objective is. I'm not trying to come up off of this whole idea of tearing down King. My desire is that God will be worshipped and not man. I don't care if that man is Martin Luther King, who I'm at odds with, or Joseph H. Jackson, who I tend to be more ideologically aligned with. I don't want to tear down, signs across America of Martin Luther King Boulevard and Martin Luther King Drive and replace those with signs of Joseph H. Jackson. Even though I agree with a lot of what Joseph H. Jackson stood for, that's not my desire or my attempt to remove one man from his pedestal and put another man on that pedestal, but that those of us who are his remnant will follow Christ and Christ alone. That's what the objective is. And so, I mean, yes, I do get that kind of criticism. I do get that kind of pushback. But the reality of it is they're trying to say that, well, if you really cared about your people, well, who is my people apart from God's remnant? God's remnant, we're made up of every tribe, every tongue, we're scattered around the world. But these are my brothers, these are my sisters. I don't have fidelity to somebody simply because we share the same skin complexion. That to me is very silly.
Chad, I want to piggyback from the previous conversation that we just had about how it's not the responsibility of the government to take care of the least of this. It's incumbent upon each and every individual. And for me, as a Christian, I think that's a responsibility that we should all take seriously. But I wonder if I can maybe persuade you to a more pragmatic approach, because I think that many people who recently after the Cold War, which some people could argue is ongoing with the ideological with the ideological the ideological thing that's going on in America. People could argue that the Cold War is still going on. I really believe that, but I think that there is a consensus nowadays. That real consensus of we can have just on a pragmatic level, that we have a free market where everyone can be able to pursue what they believe, their interests, their passions, or whatever, but they can have a system which takes care of those who really cannot take care of themselves. Because the way I see it, and I just want your perspective. How can I word this? Yes, me and Roger and everybody say in our local church can commit ourselves to help whoever is around us. But to what extent are we able to help everyone on an individual level? Whereas, in the UK, and I think to an extent in the United States, what we have right now is a merger of systems where, yes, we have a free market economy, but for those who are struggling, for those who need help, there's a bit of a welfare state that what's the word I'm looking for? There's a free market with a cushion, shall we say?
Yeah.
So that people do not fall off the cracks. I because it seems like you're very stringent in your approach and that you are opposed to that. But my question is, are you not just also are you not worried that a lot of people will not be cared for as a result? And I know that many conservative pundits like yourself will say, yes, but we have the family and we have the church. But you also understand that post Genesis 3, we live in a fallen world. There's such a reality as broken families. that you can go to someone and say, "Oh, you're poor, you're poor. Why don't you go get help from your family?" And they'll be like, "Well, my dad run away." So, don't you think that then kind of that necessitates a bit of a somewhat of a like a government welfare system, which doesn't impede people from we don't want to make people lazy, but it can be that's what I'm looking for, a safety net. I think Tony Blair and Bill
That's
Clinton.
actually that's exactly what it does, though.
No,
I
no,
mean,
but
you
it
can't
could be
say that
some. I think
that
that, but Chad, if I
go
may,
ahead.
I think the
Yeah.
third way that Bill Clinton tried to introduce and Tony Blair, his British counterpart, is I think they were very aware of the ongoing debate between the left and the right, and they were trying to come to a consensus of yes, we do want a free market economy, but we also want to have a safety net in which the least of these, quote unquote, can be able to that safety net can serve as a springboard from which people can help themselves um, um, move from one stage to the other. Now, I know you will say that, oh, but people abuse it. But the question is, I we're talking ideologically high altitude here. You might say we want to, well, the third way is not working, so let's throw it away. But because of its heart's intention, are you really going to throw the baby with the bathwater, so to speak? And I know you might say there's no baby there, but I would like to shed your light on this idea of third wayism, considering the ongoing conversation between that we've had globally and ideologically over the years between east and west, between left and right. What do you think about that consensus about how we can move forward with that third way model? I wonder, yours are very strict conservative. What's your view on that?
Well, I don't particularly like this phrase "very strict conservative," but that's neither
Well,
here nor there. Let
forgive
me
me for
just
the
say that
definition.
sorry.
Forgive me for you employing the wrong words to define, but I think you know exactly what I mean. Chad, you're
I
being
do.
cheeky now. I know you know exactly what I mean.
No, I
You
do. I
know
do.
what
I
I
do.
mean, Chad.
I
But
just
what's
don't
your
want.
answer though?
I just don't want my the things that I'm saying to be relegated to, oh, those are just conservative views.
Yeah.
Um, because that's not the heart from which I'm coming. But that's neither here nor there. Let me first just say that I really thank you, the two of you, for the questions that you're asking and for the pushback that you're offering. I think that this kind of discourse is sorely needed today. Um,
Appreciate it. Appreciate it.
and I mean that genuinely. Um, so the
By the
fact of
way,
the matter is,
big sure to big us up after the end. Yeah, on your Instagram, social media. Be sure to
oh no no no
or
no
have.
no. Here's the thing. I welcome questions. Like
Mhm.
in a constitutional republic like we have in the United States, or we're supposed to have. I think we're a far cry from that. But in a constitutional republic, questions are necessary. They're required. You're required to ask questions of your elected officials, of the so-called expert class, the people who run society and the social engineer. You're required to ask questions. Unfortunately, we haven't asked the right questions for years. But even those of us who ask questions need to be, we need to have questions asked of us. So it goes both ways. And it will be a dereliction of duty for me um, to run for the hills the second questions start coming my way. Like I should be made to answer questions too. In the same way that I'm asking questions, I should be made to answer questions too. And to do so in a respectful way, and to do so in a way that actually answers the questions instead of dancing around the questions. So I genuinely do appreciate you, the two of you, for pushing back, because I think that's necessary. I really do. My answer to your question is that the when it comes to benevolence, and when it comes to what should we do for the least of these from a government perspective or from a policy making perspective, what tends to be missing from the equation and from the conversation is the agency of the individual. Yes, the family dynamic is necessary. The family dynamic is God given. But to the extent the family is dysfunctional, to the extent that the family is lazy, or whatever the case may be, at the bottom of it, you still have human agency. And everybody is talking about what to do for the least of these. The sociologists, the cognitive scientists, the politicians and policymakers, everybody's talking about the individual as though the individual is an inanimate object that can only go and do what all of these so-called experts do for them. What about the human agency of the individual? I think, and I think this based upon educated reasoning, that when it comes to what to do about the least of these, the answer to that question is found more in the private sector than in the public sector. This is true and has been true long before the government had the bright idea to step in and to do something about it. There's a lot of critique that I have for Ronald Reagan. I'm not somebody who believes that Ronald Reagan is next to God and all of his policies are great. No, there's a lot of policies that Ronald Reagan implemented that I totally disagree with. But one of the things that he said that I think is absolutely spot on is some of the worst words you'll ever hear is I'm from the government and I'm here to help. Because what tends to happen is there's an adverse effect on society when it comes to the government and all of its minions and all of its sociologists and all of its, experts who know more than the rest of us. There's an adverse effect that happens in society when the government steps in and broadens itself, expands its authority at the expense of the individual. And we've seen this happen time and time again. To the extent that the government gets in and passes more policies, passes more legislation, things actually get worse. They just do. Whenever the thing about it too, just from a practical point, is when it comes to benevolence and when it comes to the help that's offered to an individual who's down on their luck or whatever the case may be, to the extent that it's done in the private sector, there's actual humanity at play there, right? Because you have people who start nonprofits and people who, start churches and whatever the case may be, who are helping the least of these because they actually want to. They actually have a heart behind it. Whereas somebody who is a social worker who works for the government, they're doing it obligatorily because they have a job. They have a job and they're given a certain, a certain number of rations and they have to disperse those rations accordingly. You go into some of these government buildings, it's dry, it's cold, it's heartless. You have to answer some questions and then they make a decision as to whether you qualify or not. And then not only that,
if I could just push back just a little bit, there are actually some individuals whose dreams are to take on some jobs as being a social worker because they believe that is the means by which they can be able to
no, I'm actually liking what Chad's saying, yeah, because I tell you why, guys, yeah, and it's something that I've always majored on, right, is what is the role of our churches? You know what I'm saying? I've worked in care homes, yeah, which for children, and I've always said to my friends, I said, listen, why haven't we got homes owned by churches doing what the Bible asks us? It should be a natural bit. If we're going to take care of the orphans, somebody's lost their parents, we should have a system in place to support that within that space, because the enterprise there, the church, the youth groups or youth clubs and whatever are there to support that framework and find ways of people either funding them or they get funding, and it's kind of entrepreneur rather than a government built thing, which I've seen people do a very poor job for young people, and things go very nasty in them places when it's just a job and you give by the government, and almost you see a load of children been set up to fail. Hence why I've actually come out to me personally, I don't want to go as I'm a skilled youth worker and whatsoever, and I've been in them spaces and they frustrate the heck of me, and I didn't want to get further because I felt like this system is set to put for the children to fail. But the trueness within taking care of the poor is to really set up bespoke ways that are there to work with young people. So when young people come and work with myself, you create bespoke things because of my passion for young people, not people that coming in there, yo, I got to pay my bills. Just shut up, kid. You know what I'm saying? You know what I'm saying? So that's the government set up system. You know what I'm saying? Against, so I get where Chad's in because really and truly, the private approach, the true private, not the working off the council, giving them handouts and they just see it as a job like that. But the true people that are doing it from a private standpoint are the best people to do it. You know what I'm saying? And it challenges the church to say, are you doing it?
Can I also add that, Chad, I really appreciate also your point about human agency, because if I could be so bold and honest, to your point, I'm actually giving you an example and proving to you that I think you do have a point, because me as an individual, there have been such circumstances where, say, I lose a job, and I do take advantage of, say, the benefits that are afforded to me. But at the moment when I fell into benefits, I utilized that time to actually go out and look for a job, to change my circumstances. And I can see your point about agency, the fact that people in that very same position might not always make that decision to say, okay, this is actually an available platform by which I can be able to change my circumstance, rather than, oh, I'm just going to sit here then because I have the money. So I definitely want to say I really think that the factor of agency is very important, because I could have, there was a time I was on benefits, Roger, and I was making quite a bit to make me say, you know what, I'm just going to relax. But for me, as a Christian and as an individual, with somebody who has dreams and goals and ambitions, and somebody who believes that I have gifts and talents and a mandate that the Lord has given for me to fulfill, I saw it as and obviously I have a good dad, so he wouldn't let me. That was the avenue, like, with this little money, go and look for a job, go get that laptop, invest in your skills, go get you call it resume, improve your CV, prepare for that interview, rather than, oh, well, since it's all that. So I just want to say aloud, I agree. I see where you're coming from, both of you. But I also think, I think in terms of benevolence, the agency of the individual is so important, because let's be honest, even in a bit to help people, you would agree, Roger, there's some people who don't want to be helped.
Yeah,
they want to be massaged, but they don't want to be, I don't know if that's the right word, they want to be sympathized with, but they don't want to change the circumstances. They somewhat love the pity. They love the pity party, and they want people to kind of help them in that pity party. But we need people like Chad to be like, hey, get your ass up. Do something with your life, Well, it's true.
To be honest, Chad, I'm from a generation that basically, I remember coming through college, and you unfortunately, the thing that was happening with the young of our black sisters there, and they probably beat me up by saying this, man, but a lot of them were like having children and getting flats. Yeah, you know what I'm saying? Getting accommodation straight through. And the thing is, what are we reaping from that? Broken, you know what I'm saying? These issues now is issues with their children. You know what I'm saying? You know what I mean? And just...
Chad has actually spoken about this. The fact that you've spoken about this, Chad, haven't you? The fact that the state has replaced the fatherly role, innit? And I think, and Roger is saying that he sees a similar thing in this country where, well, if a woman's pregnant, there's already home. And you've always asked, where are the dads? Where are the men? Where, like how we started the conversation, where are the men who are going to take up that role, that man, that responsibility to lead and to take care, and to shepherd the family?
But the thing is, going back to how we look at isms. Let's look at isms, Chad. You mentioned isms, yeah? And then people look at yourself, and I will go to your Instagram and go, yeah, he's a capitalism guy, yeah? You know what I'm saying? Because, that's what we do, yeah? You know, capitalism. And after this conversation, I'm listening and whatever, changing. I understand where you sit in the spectrum, in terms of not even in the spectrum itself, but you almost sit saying, okay, right, where you sit in terms of I like the way you use that word free market, because the way you said you never used free market loosely, used it very in a purposeful way. Once you said that, and I pinned back, hold on. This is free market in its space. It's not free market. Is not capitalism. But what you're saying is, I like the way that you are looking into MLK in one sense, because I do feel that the truth of history. We could have everything burnt up, but what you've done, if you people check out Chad's Instagram, he's looked at other people that have been positive. So you're not just burning down MLK and going, oh guys, the whole movement was trash and whatsoever, but you also emphasize some of the great moves of I believe was it Reverend, is it Jackson, where he had he lived 90 years it was, or something like that, and he was very positive. He saw some of the issues that they were having in the South, and he actually supported them and actually said, listen, I'm going to set you up, and then this is where I want you to go from there. And that community, that church community supported not only entrepreneurship as well as from what I could tell from what you were saying. And we need to see more of that. You know what I'm saying? We need to see okay, black churches, yes. You're walking up and down the street. That's what that's what you're almost coming against. Stop going out there and walking up and saying Black Lives Matter in one sense. But why don't you say how can we get our sons from going into prison? How can we get our sons engaged into work and off the streets? What
can we do? Not just. I think I definitely appreciate Chad's impulse. Whereas I wouldn't go all the way saying we shouldn't have a welfare state or a safety net. I definitely believe that we have a responsibility and we have agency. We've had a wonderful conversation, and I think we want to segue and end this conversation and maybe talk a little bit about the recent events. As somebody who's like a growing key political commentator, it would be worth getting 2 cents on some of the things that have happened recently. We talked about one of our episodes, Chad. We talked about, of course, the sad passing of another key political commentator, Charlie Kirk. The question that we have for you is, in the wake of Charlie Kirk's tragic death, how do you see the conservative movement evolving and de-evolving? And obviously, there's some things I'm sure, as somebody, you have some friends there. There's been some divisiveness and, dare I say, craziness. But what's your assessment of things in that regard?
Yeah. So before I answer that question, I just want to clarify something real quickly. So I wanted to just really briefly touch on capitalism, because I mentioned it earlier, and I said that there's a reason why I don't position myself as an advocate of capitalism, because I focus on those last 3 letters, the ISM, really connoting a doctrine of the pursuit of capital above all else. This whole binary of capitalism and communism, and you have to have one or the other, is basically a lie. And not only is it a lie, it's a lie that was furthered by none other than the communists. And this word capitalism or capitalist was initially meant as a derogatory slur against people who have money, people who are wealthy, business owners, the so-called ruling class or the industrial class. And it was part of this framework of really a revolutionary ideology, where Karl Marx said, workers of the world unite. They had this kind of vision of an economic warfare, the working class against the ruling class, the working class being the proletariat, and the ruling class being the bourgeoisie, and the middle class who cape for and carry the water for the wealthy. And so this binary, once again, is a lie, because not everybody who has money is a capitalist. And I know a lot of people who I mean, it's fashionable to say, well, I'm a capitalist. The so-called conservatives have taken that word sanitize it, and they embrace it. They lean into it. But what is a capitalist really? Um, I think that the Marxists are right to some degree when they lament and they lambast those who pursue capital above all else, because we've seen this actually work out in society. We've seen people who hold capital as God really, that ideology dictate how they operate within the free market system, whether it means making vehicles that are not meant to last because they have the idea of having repeat customers come back again and again and again because their vehicles are constantly breaking down. We see it in the home building industry, where homes these days are built with cheap products which break down, and then that keeps people perpetually in the marketplace. You see it in the healthcare industry and the pharmaceutical industry, and medicine, where rather than being treated for the root cause of ailments, people just get hooked on prescription pills, and you create repeat customers in the pharmaceutical industry. So you do see a lot of corruption and a lot of capital above all else that's being done. But what do you do about those people? What do you do about the capitalist? Because not everybody who's wealthy and well-moneyed are capitalists by the definition that I am positing here. You have a lot of people who have the gift of making money, who are good stewards of what they have. They're like the person who was given the 5 talents and doubled them, not through nefarious means, not through dishonest means, but through honest means, making good quality products, employing people, giving them good benefits, and treating them well in the workplace. You have individuals who are wealthy and who don't treat their employers well, or employees well, who give them faulty benefits, and who make poor products that and corner markets and monopolize markets, making it to where the consumer has no choice but to buy their product. You see some predatory issues going on in the marketplace. What do you do about these people? The person who wants to see the free market system prevail has a different answer than a communist. The communist says, if you're Vladimir Lenin or Castro or Mao Zedong or any of these others, say that you should seize their wealth, you should send them to the gulags, you should line them up against the wall and shoot them because they're an enemy of the people. You should seize their property and make it centralized and nationalized and controlled by the oligarchy. They are very hostile to this group. Those who wish to see the free market prevail say something actually much more simpler. Don't buy their products. In a free market system, you have the freedom to shop elsewhere with people who share your values, right? And so I'm not disregarding or ignoring or pretending that predatory capitalists don't exist. I'm not doing that.
Yeah.
But the question, once again, is what do you do about those people, right? And what tends to happen is, in the name of capitalism and preserving capitalism, what we have seen is a lot of these people get in cahoots with the government. So the government is fashioning policy and legislation that treat these companies and treat these individuals as if they're too big to fail. And they're constantly bailing them out and doing things that furthers inflation, makes the cost of living much higher. The same government who caused the problem, is trying to fix the problem, and the fixing of the problem, they make the problem worse, right? But the answer is not an embracing of communism, because the communist system is much worse. Because to the extent that you crack down on the 1% as enemies of the people, at the very least, they're creating jobs. And whether you are making meager income or whether you are making a comfortable living with your income, at least they have a job, right? And we're not going to fix all things. As Thomas Sowell once said, there's no such thing as solutions. There's only trade-offs. Right? And in your ability to, and in your attempt to try to fix everything through government solutions, what tends to happen is you're making things worse. If you think about all the so-called great people of the 20th century who were taught in our history books to laud and to glorify and all the things, what's interesting is that most of these people are known for their speeches. They're known for the things that they said. And I think people, they fail to ever ask the question, well, what is the point of a speech? The point of a speech is to emote people, is to steer emotions, to steer feelings that people will let their guard down and be embracing and endorsing of policies and agendas. And so by extension of those speeches, those agendas, those policies, that legislation is seen as an automatic good thing. And very rarely do people come out and actually analyze and look to see whether those ideas and the implementation of those ideas actually are working out in society. Because to the extent that you do, you find that they don't. I remember, well, I don't remember because I wasn't alive then, but I've studied this. But whenever they were pushing, oh, we need the teaching of birth control and sex in schools because the, the out of wedlock births and STDs, they're out of control. So the government implemented policies where they would teach sex education and all these things in school. And as a result of this, STDs, out of wedlock births, actually skyrocketed when the government decided to step in. Right. And so we can be as impressionable and as optimistic and as, well, we need to have some government, play and some government input, and we need to have some policies and some safety nets. It sounds good, but what are the practical and real world implications of these ideas once they're implemented? To live in a free society doesn't necessarily mean that everything will be rainbows and butterflies and streets paved with gold. Because it takes work. Freedom takes work. To be a free people, you actually have to work at it. You actually have to be a people of virtue and morals, as John Adams once said, as I alluded to earlier. We can't continue to try to fix the problem with more government policies and more government legislation, because to the extent that we do that, we are being insane, and we're the definition of insanity is trying the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome, right? And so we can't look to politics and policies when it comes to the human problem, when it comes to the problems that we deal with on this side of heaven. We have to look to what saith the Lord. And I understand not everybody serves the Lord. Not everybody's a Christian. But we are to lead by example. We are to exemplify biblical values on the earth. And that doesn't start with what can we do within government. That starts with what can we do within ourselves? What can we do within our homes? What can we do within our church? What can we do within our local community? To be that light, that shining light, to be the salt. To the extent that we're not being the salt, the Bible says that we're good for nothing but being trampled under the foot of man. And I mean, this isn't a rehearsed line. I'm basically speaking from the heart. What's the significance of light? The light illuminates, it shines, it attracts. That's what light does. And the problem that so many of us as Christians have is that we've dimmed our lights. We're not recognizable. We're not distinguishable from the world. And rather than looking to the scriptures to figure out how to handle these problems, we default to political parties and political movements because we believe legislation will fix it, which leads to this question that you just asked about, Charlie Kirk, and the current state of the conservative movement. The conservative movement is in disarray because it forgot God. They might use biblical language and godly language on the campaign trail to steer emotions and to make people think that they're on their side, but they are just as lost as the so-called left. because they're placating, they're pretending, they're not for real at all.
Come on now.
And so what we're seeing in terms of the infighting and the conflict and all the things, Candace Owens versus the Turning Point USA and all the, it's par for the course. The writing was on the wall, and it has been on the wall for a long time. Because, you know, as Martin Luther King once ironically said, a lie can't live forever. The truth will eventually come out. The truth is coming out about him. The truth is coming out about what the real motives and intent is of the so-called modern conservative pundits, who are just as much for themselves as those who are on the so-called left. But where is God's remnant? Where are they at? We have voices, or had voices, like Dr. Vodi Bakum, among others. But the first shall be last, and the last shall be first. And unfortunately, those who are truly for God's kingdom are relegated to a footnote, just like I said with Joseph H. Jackson, as you alluded to earlier.
Yeah. Great.
Right? Here's a man who, rather than lobbying the government and taking the problems to the government, he bought the 400 acres of land in Tennessee and told these sharecroppers, you can work this land rent-free, pocket the money that you make from your crops, and we encourage you to go out and buy your own farmland, so you're not subordinate to every whim of the farmer who may or may not be taking advantage of you. There's practical solutions to the problems that ail us. Another video that I just shared here on Instagram here recently was that of Marva Collins, who is a native of Mississippi. And she moved to Chicago and found that the schools were failing the children. She didn't complain. She didn't protest. She didn't take it to the government or to the school board. What she did was she took the second floor of her home and turned it into a school. And she accepted and received all of the kids who were rejected by the Chicago public school system, either because of some learning deficiency or behavioral issue. She accepted those kids. She read Shakespeare to them. She taught them math and reading. And within a short space of time, they were reading and doing math well above their grade level, whereas before they were reading and doing math 4 or 5 grade levels behind. Because she actually put into action the principles and the values that we read about in the scriptures. She actually read scripture to her children, or to her students. And so we can't keep punting the responsibility, and we're not going to fix every problem. The poor you will always have among you, said Jesus. And so I get your point about, well, what about, I mean, sure, we can do something in our local community with the poor and whatever, but what about this person over there in Wisconsin? What about this person over there in Birmingham? What about this person over here in this, state or county or whatever? What about them? Be faithful with what you have, with what's in front of you. Be that light. Light attracts. We know God's word does not return to him void. He sends it out. It accomplishes what it seeks out to accomplish. I, for one, when I travel this country of ours and I see certain communities, certain Christ-centered communities doing certain things, and they're actually being the light, it's working within God's providence, because I think, I can actually be doing that in my community. And I take it back and I try to implement some of those ideas and some of those practical salt and light things that I'm seeing. And so in a roundabout way, what they're doing in Moscow, Idaho, is actually being implemented in Dallas, Texas, however many hundreds of thousands of miles away. I mean, Moscow, Idaho is up at the west, the west, the northwest portion of the country. Yeah. I'm all the way down here at the bottom of the country here in Texas. And the people in Moscow didn't have to worry about what's going on in Dallas. All it took was for me to see it and to bring it back over here. So these things are accomplishing, and they're working their way out in God's timing. And it's not, you don't have to be in Moscow, Idaho. We need to go to the federal government so that way the people down in Dallas, Texas can be affected and be helped. No, we are called to go to the ends of the earth, and you don't have to physically go to the ends of the earth. You can just work within your community. People see it. You're being that light. You're being that salt. It's attractive. People take it. They're drawn to it, and they go and implement it elsewhere. So we don't have to be everywhere all at once. We're not omniscient. We're not God. We are to make ourselves vessels to be poured in by God and then poured out. That's how this whole thing works. And so we don't have to have these big grandiose ideas, these big, overarching sweeping ideas where we begin to include the government to coerce our unbelieving tax-paying neighbor to do what we are to be doing as the remnant.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, again, I don't align with the modern Republican
Totally
Party or the modern conservative movement, because oftentimes what you find is that they are at odds with those of us who are truly God's remnant.
Mm-hmm.
So that's hopefully that answered your question.
I think that's a great way of ending, man. You know what I'm saying? Because and I yeah,
Giving me a lot to think about.
Yeah.
Definitely
No.
giving me a lot to think about. Yeah.
To be honest, Chad, there's a lot of things which I totally get where you're coming from, and you brought a lot of clarity for me, because when I looked at myself in terms of the political spectrum, I struggle to see, when you come to voting and you're thinking, if the elections were on tomorrow, how would I vote? Who would I side with, whatever? Because it's absolute craziness. But this conversation has helped me as a Christian, and this is why it's good for men to talk, and like you said, to have this conversation. And I hope people, when they listen to this conversation, we hear three men having a conversation, coming into the space from different angles, and actually going, oh, I got food for thought here. For me to go back and actually, when I have conversations outside of here, I can bring the context of other viewpoints and other angles. And I think so often we are very toxic in the way we approach different approaches right now. And I just appreciate this space that we've created today to have, not to come in and says, I'm going to throw curses at you because you're going to destroy my idol, Martin MLK himself, but to come on, let's talk and let's reason. Let's reason this out. And I think it's amazing that we do appreciate this time. Definitely. I don't know how you want to end it, bro. You know what I'm saying? But
Chad,
it's fantastic.
Chad, thank you for taking the time to have this conversation. And I hope that we have been able to model to those who are watching how we can have different perspectives, but even speak to each other in a very respectful way. I really also applaud how you even mentioned Killer Mike, who I know on many different topics you are at odds with, but you lauded how respectfully you engaged with him. And that's the purpose of Ideologees. We talk to people who have different perspectives, but to model that spirit of civility, because as you're aware, we live in a very divisive age where people are demonizing people they disagree with. But we are of the view of, I will be honest, we don't agree with every single political point, and you don't agree with everything that we say, but we can have this conversation in a respectful way. And
But we are the remnant. Let's be real. We are the remnant, and there's got to be ability to actually have this conversation. And we don't have these conversations as a remnant. In this space, we're uncomfortable too. We focus on a quick push dialogue, and that's it. Go and sort yourself out for the rest of the week. This is important, and this is we all filmmakers here. We all in. You know what I'm saying? And this is how we know that nothing is done by accident and by chance when it comes to the film industry. Nothing is just a random story. Star Wars is not random. All these great movies are not randomly done. There's somebody's opinion is flowing through that. And we have to, as creatives, as documentary filmmakers, is to put content out there, but to know that people know that there's an integrity to what we're doing. And it's not just, I want to do this because I want to get more likes. And that's not how we should move in this space. We're not moving for likes. We're moving for truth. And truth will, like you said, will go through the test of time.
And we live in an age, Chad would agree. But what gets more clicks if we were in this conversation and we were having it at each other. But I would gladly, let me say this, and I'll end with this, and I'm sure Chad would agree. I'd rather 3 likes for having a respectful conversation with someone I disagree with than 500 likes being combative and
abusive,
insulting
yep.
and abusive because of people I disagree with. So for those 3 likes,
Come on now.
because of this conversation, I would say I've done my job.
Yeah.
Chad, thank you so much for your
man.
time. We really truly appreciate you taking your time to speak to us despite your busy schedule. We
Appreciate
wish
it, bro.
you a pleasant evening, and hopefully we can speak again.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you guys. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. And what we'll do, we'll make people, guys, make sure we'll put all these details in the description. You know what I'm saying? You can see all the details so you can follow. And trust me, his Instagram is real interesting. So you can really, really get the breadth of what is going on and what's being communicated out there and everything like that. So just appreciate your time, bro. And really thanks again.
Thank you guys.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for watching the content we're putting out. Listen, make sure that you are liking, subscribing and following us on all our social channels, including patreon.com. Make sure you're finding us on there to support what we do so we can support you. And remember, guys, be extra.